The smell of cinnamon and apple pie filled the air as the golden autumn light poured through the tall windows of our family's lakeside home in Vermont. My father, Richard Carter, sat at the head of the long oak dining table, wearing the navy sweater I had given him for his 75th birthday. His white hair was neatly combed, his eyes a little tired, but warm as they swept over the gathered family. This house, a cedar frame structure that had stood for generations on the shore of Lake Willoughby, was more than just a building. It was my mother's legacy, a place of laughter, tears, and thousands of small moments that built our family's story. I had left my promising career as an architect in Boston 4 years ago to come back here when Mom died of cancer. Dad's mild stroke 2 months later had sealed my decision. I walked away from high-rise projects and firm deadlines to cook his meals, drive him to physical therapy, and help him with the stairs on his bad days. Some people told me it was admirable. Others, like my older brother Brandon, called it throwing away my future. Brandon Carter, 38, was the golden boy. He ran a small but flashy real estate development firm, drove imported cars, and posted photos from ski resorts and tropical beaches with his perfectly groomed second wife. He rarely visited unless it was for a holiday or an event where he could hold court as the most successful member of the family. He had not been around much for Mom's final months. He had not been there for Dad's long recovery. But here he was now, standing with a wine glass in his hand, wearing that smug smile I knew so well. Melissa, Dad's new wife of just over a year, stood beside him. She was in her mid-40s, with a taste for expensive dresses and a way of speaking to people as if she were constantly auditioning for a part she thought she deserved. She had worked in financial management before meeting Dad at a charity dinner. From the very beginning, I had sensed something cold behind her warm smile. She was always interested in the value of things, the value of the house, the value of Dad's investments, the value of the land. I caught the way she ran her eyes over the beams in the living room and the original brick fireplace, as if mentally converting them into a listing price. I had made the birthday special for Dad. Weeks of planning, of cleaning every corner, cooking his favorite roast chicken with herbs from the garden, baking the apple pie from Mom's handwritten recipe. Friends and neighbors had come. There was laughter, and for a moment, I could almost believe we were just a normal family celebrating a milestone. Then Brandon tapped his glass with his spoon. The conversations died down. He smiled as if he were about to deliver the most wonderful surprise. "Dad, he began today is a big day. You have been through a lot, and Melissa and I have been talking. We think it's time for some big changes." He looked around at the table, drawing in the attention like a performer who knows he has the best line of the night. "We have found the perfect solution for everyone. You will love it." He took a sip of wine for effect. "Pack your bags, loser. This house is going up for sale." For a moment there was silence. Then unbelievably people started clapping. Melissa clung to Dad's arm with a bright smile. "This is going to be so good for you, darling." Sophie and Claire, our cousins, nodded in approval. Someone even raised their glass and toasted to new beginnings. I looked at Dad. His brow was furrowed. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The man who had built tree houses for us in the backyard, who had taught me to swim in the cold lake water, looked smaller than I had ever seen him. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew this was coming. I had seen the signs, the private conversations between Brandon and Melissa when they thought I was out, the sudden visits from appraisers posing as old friends, the way Dad had been so groggy in the evenings lately after Melissa's herbal tea. But hearing it said out loud in front of everyone on my father's birthday with glasses raised in celebration was like being punched in the gut. I did not trust myself to speak. If I opened my mouth now, I might scream. Instead, I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping loudly on the hardwood floor. I walked to the front door, ignoring Brandon's voice calling after me something about growing up and facing reality. The cold air outside hit my face crisp and sharp with the smell of fallen leaves. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed. It was picked up on the second ring. "It's happening," I said, my voice low and tight. "Get here now." 10 minutes later, the screaming started. This house was not just wood and stone to me. It was my mother's legacy left to Dad in her will. with the clear intent that it would pass to her children, specifically to the one caring for him in his later years. Every corner of it was tied to a memory. The screened porch where she used to drink tea on summer mornings, the upstairs hallway where Brandon and I had raced each other in our socks when we were little, the kitchen where she had taught me how to knead bread while telling me stories about her own childhood. Selling it would not only strip away Dad's comfort, but also erase the last tangible connection to Mom. The stakes were more than sentimental. Without the house, Dad would be forced into a senior facility one Brandon had already hinted at. On paper, it sounded nice with glossy brochures showing smiling residents and manicured gardens. But I knew those places could be isolating, impersonal, and expensive, and I suspected the facility Brandon was pushing had connections to his business associates. If they could convince Dad to move, the sale of the house would generate a large sum of money. Brandon would no doubt find ways to siphon it off under the guise of financial management fees. Melissa would ensure she had influence over every dollar, her fingers wrapped tightly around Dad's accounts. What made it worse was how vulnerable Dad had become lately. Over the past few months, he had started forgetting small things, names of neighbors he had known for years, where he had put his keys, whether he had already eaten lunch. I had chalked it up to aging at first until I noticed the pattern. The confusion always seemed worse after Melissa served him her so-called special calming tea in the evenings. I had tasted it once, pretending to be curious about the recipe, and it had left a bitter aftertaste that no herbal blend should have. Sometimes he was so drowsy he would nod off mid-conversation. Other times he was irritable and suspicious, a complete departure from his usual gentle demeanor. It was not just forgetfulness. It was something being done to him. The personal cost for me had already been high. I had walked away from a promising career in architecture in Boston, where I had been part of a team designing high-profile projects. I had ended a long-term relationship with a man who refused to leave the city. I had sold my condo to free up cash for home repairs and Dad's medical bills. I lived frugally, wearing the same boots winter after winter, skipping vacations, eating at home. Brandon mocked me for it, calling me a charity case, living off my father's generosity, conveniently ignoring the fact that I was the one paying most of the utility bills and buying groceries. Melissa had joined in lately, her comments wrapped in a sugar-coated voice that barely hid the sting. "You must be so tired of this little town, Emily. Don't you want a life of your own?" She would say it in front of Dad, making it sound like concern, but her eyes would be cold and calculating. I knew exactly what kind of life she had in mind for me, somewhere far away, without the house, without Dad, out of her and Brandon's way. The real danger was that they were moving quickly. The real estate market in our area was hot, and I had overheard Brandon telling Melissa that with the right push, they could have the house listed and sold within weeks. They could use Dad's apparent decline to justify the sale and the move to a facility, making it seem like the compassionate choice. Once the house was sold, the money would be theirs to manage. I had seen how fast Brandon could move when there was profit to be made. I had no illusions about him respecting Mom's wishes or Dad's comfort if they stood in the way of a payday. The stakes were high for Dad's safety and dignity. They were high for preserving our family history. But they were also high for me personally. If they succeeded, I would lose not only my home, but the man I had been caring for these past 4 years, to a place where I could not protect him from their influence. It would be the final erasure of my role in his life, replaced by Brandon's control and Melissa's manipulation. And there was another layer, one that kept me awake at night. I had seen Melissa's temper when she thought no one was watching. The way her jaw tightened, the sharpness in her voice when she snapped at Dad over something small, the way she once grabbed his arm just a little too hard when he hesitated to take a pill she handed him. It was not overt physical violence, but it was there simmering under the surface. If she had full control of his environment, I feared what she might feel free to do. That was why losing the house was not an option. This was not about stubbornly clinging to a building. It was about keeping Dad safe, honoring Mom's explicit wishes, and preventing two people with questionable morals from gaining unchecked access to assets they would exploit. It was about standing between my father and the people who were supposed to love him, but were already betraying him. The Carters had always been a family that looked good from the outside, but felt like walking on glass inside. When Mom was alive, she acted as the buffer, smoothing over the sharp edges and keeping the peace. But after she passed, the cracks widened. Brandon had always been Dad's pride, the son who went into business, wore expensive suits, and talked about deals over cocktails at the country club. He was the first to get married, the first to buy a house, the first to make six figures, and he never let anyone forget it. I had been the dreamer, the one who liked to draw houses instead of flipping them, the one who stayed up late sketching ideas while my friends went to parties. To Brandon, that was weakness, not vision. He had told me more than once that architecture was just glorified drafting, and that the real money was in development. He meant his kind of development, buying low and selling high, with little concern for who got displaced in the process. Melissa fit into that mold perfectly. When she came into Dad's life, she brought a polished smile and a resume that made her sound competent and trustworthy. She had managed client portfolios, run financial seminars, and knew how to make herself seem indispensable. I had no doubt she knew exactly what she was doing when she married a man with a valuable paid-off property and a daughter she could paint as a dependent. Her friendliness toward me in the beginning had been just convincing enough to keep Dad from noticing the occasional barbed comment. Over time, those comments became more frequent. She would ask about my job search in front of guests, knowing I had chosen to stay home and care for Dad. She would mention how hard it must be to be single at my age, her tone dripping with pity. She even joked once that I was like the live-in nanny she never had to pay for, except I was looking after an old man instead of children. At family gatherings, Brandon and Melissa's influence was obvious. Our two cousins, Sophie and Claire, daughters of Dad's late sister, seemed to orbit around Brandon's approval. They had always admired him and took his word as fact. When he framed the idea of selling the house as a way to give Dad a better life, they nodded along without asking for details. They didn't care about the will Mom had left or her wish for the house to stay with the child caring for Dad. They saw dollar signs and perhaps a chance at a share if Brandon played it that way. The few times I tried to raise concerns, I was met with a united front. Brandon would scoff, saying I was paranoid and resistant to change. Melissa would sigh and tell me I was making things harder than they needed to be. Sophie and Claire would exchange knowing looks as if I was the one causing trouble. Dad, caught in the middle, would try to change the subject, but I could see it wearing him down, the constant drip of persuasion, the way Melissa would rest her hand on his arm when Brandon spoke like they were presenting a joint case in court. The toxicity went beyond money. There was an unspoken hierarchy in our family, and I was at the bottom of it. Brandon controlled the narrative, and Melissa amplified it. I was cast as the one who never left home, who could not manage on her own, who was clinging to Dad because I had nothing else. It was a story that made their plans easier to justify. If I was just a dependent, then removing me from the house was not cruelty. It was necessary, tough love. They even began planting seeds with Dad about how much better I would do if I moved away, found a job in a bigger city, maybe met someone. Dad would repeat these ideas to me like he thought they were his own, not realizing they had been fed to him. The more I resisted, the more Brandon turned up the pressure. He started showing up with printouts of property listings, talking about market trends, tossing around terms like equity release and lifestyle optimization. He made it sound like a business transaction instead of a betrayal. Melissa, meanwhile, kept up her quiet campaign, hinting at how much easier her marriage to Dad would be without a third person in the house. She talked about privacy, about how couples needed their own space, about how Dad deserved to live without feeling like a burden to anyone. She never said it outright, but the message was clear in her eyes. I was the intruder. There were moments when I wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe I had been too quick to judge her. But then I would catch a look between her and Brandon, the kind of look that passes unspoken understanding, and my stomach would tighten. I remembered overhearing them once in the kitchen, when they thought I was outside. Melissa's voice had been low but firm. She said something about timelines and making sure Dad stayed on board. Brandon had replied that he was handling me and that once the papers were signed, it would be too late for me to interfere. Those words stayed with me, feeding a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface. This was not just a family with differences of opinion. This was a family where loyalty had been replaced by self-interest, where manipulation passed for concern, and where the person doing the caring was painted as the problem. I had grown up in these dynamics. I knew how dangerous they could be when left unchecked, and I was starting to realize that if I did not push back, they would swallow not just the house, but Dad's remaining years of independence. The weeks leading up to Dad's birthday had been a study in quiet tension. Brandon's visits became more frequent, but never when Dad was at his sharpest. He seemed to prefer arriving mid-afternoon when Dad was groggy from Melissa's tea or morning pills. They would disappear into the study with the door closed, and when I tried to join them, Brandon would give me a tight smile and say they were discussing financial matters I would not understand. One afternoon, I walked past the slightly open door and caught sight of a folder spread across Dad's desk. Inside were what looked like property valuation reports, real estate agent profiles, and photographs of the house taken from multiple angles as if it were already being marketed. I stepped into the room and Brandon quickly shut the folder, his tone light but his eyes hard. "Just doing some preliminary research," he said. "No harm in knowing what the place is worth." I reminded him that Mom's will specified the house was to stay in the family, preferably with the child providing care for Dad. He shrugged, saying wills could be amended and that circumstances had changed. It was the first time he had openly dismissed Mom's wishes, and it sent a cold weight into my stomach. My suspicions about Melissa's role grew stronger when I began finding small discrepancies in Dad's medications. Once, while refilling his pill organizer, I noticed a capsule that looked different from the usual prescription. I took it to a pharmacist friend, who told me it was a sedative not on any list from Dad's doctor. I began keeping my own records, noting what pills were in each compartment, and when Melissa had been the one to prepare them. Patterns emerged. Days when Dad was more confused coincided with Melissa's care. Meanwhile, Brandon was making subtle moves to undermine my position. He began telling relatives that I seemed overwhelmed, that I had hinted at wanting to return to work, that it was too much for one person to manage Dad's care. None of it was true, but it laid the groundwork for his argument that professional care would be better. He even brought a glossy brochure for a senior living facility one evening, placing it on the kitchen counter as if it were a casual suggestion. "Oakwood Pines," it read in looping script above a photo of smiling elderly residents playing cards. I knew enough about these places to recognize the sales pitch: expensive, regimented, and most importantly for Brandon, a perfect excuse to liquidate the family home. Determined not to be caught off guard, I called Daniel Brooks, an old friend from college who had become an attorney specializing in elder law. I explained what I had seen and what I suspected. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "If they're moving towards selling the house, you need to establish legal safeguards now," he said. "We'll start with a healthcare proxy and a limited power of attorney, naming you and someone else you trust." That someone else was Uncle Tom, Dad's younger brother, and a retired police officer who had always been protective of me. He lived 2 towns over and still had a network of contacts in law enforcement. When I told him what I suspected, he didn't hesitate. "I've seen this kind of thing before," he said. "We'll make sure they don't get away with it." Over the next few weeks, Daniel helped us put everything in place. We had Dad evaluated by a neutral geriatric specialist during a week when Melissa was conveniently away visiting her sister. The doctor confirmed that while Dad had mild age-related memory issues, he was fully capable of making decisions when not under the influence of sedatives. With that documentation, Dad signed the new proxy and power of attorney, both witnessed and notarized, giving Tom and me shared authority over his health care and financial decisions. We also began installing small cameras in common areas of the house, making sure they were positioned legally but effectively to capture activity. The footage soon revealed Melissa opening pill bottles that did not belong to Dad and pouring their contents into his tea. It showed Brandon arriving with documents, placing them in front of Dad when he was clearly drowsy and guiding his hand to sign. Each new piece of evidence strengthened my resolve. I knew the confrontation was coming. It was just a matter of when. Brandon's arrogance and Melissa's greed made them impatient. They believed they were in control, that Dad's decline was inevitable, and that I was powerless to stop them. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for months, documenting every irregularity, every suspicious conversation, every subtle act meant to erode Dad's independence. By the time the birthday rolled around, I had a folder thicker than Brandon's with signed legal documents, medical reports, and video stills ready to be presented. The tension in the air was so sharp I could feel it when I set the table that morning. Melissa hummed to herself in the kitchen, her voice too bright while Brandon kept stepping outside to take phone calls. I knew they were lining up the final act of their plan. What they didn't realize was that so was I. The dining room was warm with the glow of candles and the low murmur of conversation. When Brandon stood glass in hand and tapped his spoon against it, the sound cut through the chatter like a knife. All eyes turned to him, and I felt my muscles tighten. He wore that same smug expression he always did when he thought he was about to outmaneuver everyone in the room. Dad looked up from his plate, a forkful of roast chicken halfway to his mouth, his eyes a little unfocused from the tea Melissa had insisted he drink earlier. Brandon began with honeyed words about family and sacrifice, about how much Dad had given us over the years. Then his tone shifted, becoming deliberate performative. "As many of you know, this house is a lot for Dad to manage," he said, glancing at Melissa, who squeezed Dad's shoulder, like she was the caring spouse in a movie. "We've been thinking about what's best for him, and we've come to a decision." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, holding it up like a trophy. "A few weeks ago, Dad signed over full power of attorney to me. With that authority, we've decided it's time to sell this house and move him to Oakwood Pines, a premium senior living facility where he can get round-the-clock care." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. Melissa's eyes flicked to mine, the smallest hint of triumph there. Then Brandon turned directly to me and, in front of everyone, said, "Pack your bags, loser. This house is going up for sale." A ripple of murmurs passed through the guests, followed by scattered claps from Sophie and Claire. Melissa beamed as if Brandon had just announced a charitable donation. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. I looked at Dad, his brow furrowed, confusion clouding his expression. "But Emily," he said softly, "what about the garden we planted this spring? I thought we'd see it bloom next year." Brandon laughed lightly. "Dad, you won't have to worry about a garden anymore. Oakwood has beautiful landscaping you can enjoy without the work," Melissa chimed in sweetly. "You'll have more free time, darling, and Emily can visit whenever she wants." My jaw clenched. This was their ambush. They had chosen Dad's birthday for the optics surrounding themselves with family, who either agreed with them or wouldn't interfere. It was meant to be a show of inevitability. But I had been expecting it. I pushed back my chair slowly, every movement deliberate. Without a word, I walked toward the front door, feeling Brandon's gaze follow me. The cold evening air was a shock against my skin, but it cleared my head. I pulled out my phone and dialed. "Daniel, it's happening," I said, my voice low but steady. "Bring the documents, bring Tom, and bring the doctor." 10 minutes. He didn't ask questions. I hung up and leaned against the porch railing, watching the shadows in the lit windows as Brandon held court inside. I imagined him talking about escrow and offers, already spending money that wasn't his. My anger was cold now, not hot. Controlled, focused. This wasn't just about stopping a sale. It was about making sure they couldn't try again, about stripping them of the power they thought they had. Inside, someone laughed loudly, followed by the clink of glasses. It was almost time. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke through the muffled noise from inside. Headlights swept briefly across the porch before going dark. A moment later, Daniel's black sedan rolled to a stop, and he stepped out with his leather briefcase in one hand. Behind him, Uncle Tom's pickup pulled in, and from the passenger side emerged Dr. Patel, the geriatric specialist who had examined Dad during one of Melissa's conveniently timed trips out of town. Tom's face was set in a grim line, his old police instincts evident in the way he scanned the house as we approached the front door together. "Ready?" Daniel asked quietly. "More than ready," I said, feeling a surge of resolve. When we stepped inside the dining room, the room fell silent, as if someone had turned down the volume on a radio. Brandon was mid-sentence, standing near the head of the table with a stack of papers spread out in front of Dad. Melissa's smile faltered when she saw who was with me. "What is this?" Brandon asked, his voice edged with irritation. "We're in the middle of something important." Daniel walked forward calmly, placing his briefcase on the table and opening it with precise movements. "What you're in the middle of is about to end," he said. "Dad will not be signing anything tonight." Brandon laughed, trying to sound amused, but there was a tightness in his jaw. "I already have power of attorney. I make the decisions now." "That's where you're wrong," Daniel replied, pulling out a folder and handing copies to several people around the table. "These are the legally executed healthcare proxy and limited power of attorney documents, signed by your father 2 months ago, witnessed and notarized, granting decision-making authority jointly to Emily Carter and Thomas Carter. These supersede any document you claim to have, particularly one obtained under questionable circumstances." Melissa scoffed. "This is absurd." Harold was declining rapidly. He needed Brandon to take over. Dr. Patel stepped forward, then his voice measured. "Mr. Carter was evaluated by me on June 12th, during a period when he was not under the influence of any sedatives or unauthorized medication. He was found to be cognitively capable of making his own decisions. I have reason to believe that his confusion in recent months has been artificially induced." A murmur rippled through the guests. Melissa's eyes flickered to Brandon, a flash of unease crossing her face. Tom moved closer to Dad, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We also have video evidence," Tom said, "of unauthorized substances being added to Harold's food and drink, and of documents being placed in front of him for signature, while he was visibly impaired." Daniel laid a stack of printed stills from the footage on the table. Several guests leaned in their expressions, shifting from curiosity to shock. Sophie covered her mouth. "Is that Melissa? What is that?" Melissa's voice sharpened. "You can't just record people in their own home." Tom's reply was steady. "In the common areas of the house I live in, with the consent of the homeowner, it's perfectly legal." Brandon's tone turned mocking. "This is just Emily's paranoia. She's scared of change." Daniel didn't flinch. "This is elder abuse, Brandon. And as of this moment, there is a temporary restraining order in place, preventing any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of this property." He slid another document across the table. "The real estate agent you've been working with has been notified not to proceed." At that, Melissa's composure cracked for the first time. Her lips pressed into a thin line and her eyes darted toward the door as if calculating an exit. Dad looked around the room slowly, his gaze settling on me. "Emily, is all this true?" I nodded. Every word. He sat back in his chair, a spark of clarity in his eyes I hadn't seen in months. "Then let's hear the rest." Daniel kept his voice even as he addressed the room. "The so-called power of attorney Brandon claims to hold is invalid for several reasons. It was executed while Harold Carter was under the influence of substances not prescribed by his physician, rendering him legally incapable of consenting. Furthermore, 2 months prior to that date, Harold executed this limited power of attorney naming Emily Carter and Thomas Carter as his joint decision-makers. That document explicitly revokes any prior and subsequent powers of attorney, unless signed under the same formal conditions, and with both of them present." He handed a copy to Brandon, who glanced at it and tossed it back onto the table. "Paperwork won't stop me from doing what's best for Dad," Brandon said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't about what's best for Dad," I replied, stepping forward. "It's about control and money. You've been manipulating him, lying to the rest of the family, and working with Melissa to get your hands on a house you have no claim to." Melissa's voice rose sharp and defensive. "That's a disgusting accusation. Harold, tell her how much better you've been since I moved in." Dad hesitated, his gaze shifting between us. I spoke gently but firmly. "Dad, remember when Melissa visited her sister in May? Remember how clear-headed you felt that week? How you walked to the end of the driveway without getting tired? How you played chess with me 2 nights in a row and beat me both times?" He nodded slowly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "That's because you were taking only the medication your doctor prescribed. No added sedatives, no mysterious tea." Dr. Patel confirmed this. Lauren, one of our cousins who had been sitting silently until now, looked at Brandon. "Is this true? Did you know about this?" Brandon's tone hardened. "This is all dramatics. Dad's old, he needs care. Emily's clinging to him because she has nothing else." Tom's voice cut in steady and low. And you have been siphoning funds from his accounts to cover your debts. Daniel pulled out another folder. Bank statements showing large transfers from Harold's savings into an account controlled by Brandon's company, masked as consulting fees. Over $40,000 in less than a year. Gasps around the table. Dad's face darkened. Brandon, did you take my money without asking me? Brandon's jaw tightened. It was for managing your investments. Daniel's reply was immediate. At quadruple the industry standard with no contract, no deliverables, and no oversight. That's called financial exploitation of an elder, and it's a felony in this state. Melissa's face was pale now, but she still tried to regain control. This is ridiculous. They're ganging up on us. You don't have to listen to this, Harold. I stepped closer to Dad. You don't have to listen to me, Dad, but you should listen to yourself. What do you want? Do you want to sell this house? Do you want to leave the lake, the garden, the porch where you and Mom used to sit every evening? His hands gripped the arms of his chair. No, this is my home. Melissa started to protest, but Tom raised a hand. Enough. You've both had your say. Now you're going to hear the consequences. Daniel addressed them with lawyerly precision. As of now, any attempt to sell this house without Emily and Tom's written consent will be met with immediate legal action. A petition for criminal charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to defraud will be filed tomorrow morning. Dr. Patel has drawn blood tonight to confirm the presence of unauthorized medication in Harold's system. The video evidence combined with the text messages recovered from Brandon's phone, showing premeditated discussions about acquiring the house, will be submitted to the district attorney. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were witnessing something far more serious than a family disagreement. Sophie whispered something to Claire, who stood and walked to my side, her expression grim. I didn't know, Claire said quietly. I thought you were exaggerating. I met her eyes. Now you know. Brandon's swagger was starting to crack, but he forced a laugh. You think you've won something here. You've just made an enemy. I looked at him without blinking. You made yourself my enemy the day you decided your profit was worth more than Dad's dignity. Melissa slammed her wineglass down so hard the stem snapped, red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth. This is insane, she hissed. You'll regret this. I kept my voice calm. Maybe, but not as much as you'll regret what you've done when the law catches up to you. The silence after my last words felt heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Dr. Patel finished labeling the vials of Dad's blood and placed them carefully into his medical bag. I will have these tested immediately, he said, glancing at Melissa. The results will confirm whether sedatives or other unauthorized substances are present. Melissa crossed her arms, her chin lifted defiantly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. You people are making a mistake. Brandon shoved his chair back, the legs scraping hard against the floor. This is a family matter. You have no right to drag outsiders into it. Tom stepped forward, his presence filling the room. When that family matter crosses into criminal territory, outsiders become law enforcement, Brandon. And believe me, they will be interested. Daniel pulled out another document and set it in front of Brandon. This is a copy of the emergency protective order filed this afternoon. It prevents any transfer of property, withdrawal of funds, or legal agreements involving Harold Carter's assets without joint consent from his designated decision-makers. Violation will result in immediate arrest. Brandon stared at the paper but didn't touch it. Around the table, faces that had been neutral or supportive of him earlier now looked uneasy, some even hostile. Sophie leaned toward Claire and whispered again, her eyes darting toward Melissa. The weight of public exposure was settling on them both. Melissa tried one last pivot, her voice softening as she turned to Dad. Harold, you know I love you. Everything I've done has been for you. But Dad's gaze was steady now, the fog lifting from his eyes. If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied to me. You wouldn't have taken my choices away. You wouldn't have hurt me to get what you wanted. The color drained from her face. Brandon's jaw worked as if he were grinding his teeth. Daniel closed his briefcase with a decisive click. We're done here. Melissa, you are to vacate this house immediately. Brandon, you may leave with her or on your own, but you are not to return without legal clearance. Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but Tom moved to the front door and held it open. The room watched in silence as Melissa's heels clicked across the hardwood, the sound sharp and angry. She yanked her coat from the rack and stalked outside. Brandon hesitated, glancing at Dad as if expecting him to change his mind. Dad didn't speak. Finally, Brandon muttered, "This isn't over," and followed Melissa out. The slam of the front door echoed through the dining room. For a moment, no one moved. Then Claire spoke softly. "Emily, I am so sorry. I didn't see it before." I nodded, the tension in my shoulders starting to ease, but not gone. "We still have a fight ahead," I said, "but at least now it's in the open." Outside, the sound of their car starting and pulling away was like the release of a held breath. Inside, the balance had shifted. They had been exposed, stripped of the control they thought they had, and for the first time in months, I felt like Dad was safe. After the door shut behind them, the room seemed to exhale. The tension that had been wound tight for weeks began to loosen, replaced by a quiet hum of relief. Dad looked around at the faces still gathered, his eyes resting on me. "Emily," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in months, "I owe you an apology. I should have trusted you from the start." I shook my head. "You were trying to see the best in them." "That's not a fault, Dad. That's who you are." Tom pulled out a chair beside him. "What matters is, you're safe now. We'll make sure it stays that way." Dr. Patel leaned over to reassure Dad that his test results would be expedited, and that with the sedatives out of his system, he would likely regain much of his clarity and energy. Claire came to my side, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "I believed Brandon because it was easier. I'm sorry." I told her the truth. It wasn't about me winning her over. It was about Dad being treated with dignity. Over the next hour, we began quietly rearranging the evening. The cake was brought back out, the candles relit. Dad smiled genuinely this time as we sang to him, the earlier shadow in his eyes gone. When he cut the cake and handed me the first slice, it felt like a small symbol of trust being handed back as well. Later, when the guests left and the house was still, I sat with Dad in the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the photographs on the mantel. "You know," he said, "your mother would be proud. Not just that you protected the house, but that you stood up for what was right even when it was hard." I squeezed his hand. "I learned that from both of you." In the weeks that followed the birthday confrontation, the house felt different, lighter, as if the walls themselves had released a long-held breath. The legal process moved quickly. Dr. Patel's report confirmed the presence of unauthorized sedatives in Dad's system, and the district attorney opened an investigation into both Brandon and Melissa. The restraining order remained in place, and the bank froze the accounts Brandon had been siphoning from. Melissa vacated the area entirely after being served with notice of potential criminal charges, and Brandon's reputation in the local business community began to crumble. For Dad and me, life settled into a new rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch overlooking the lake became our quiet ritual. We planted the garden he had worried about losing, watching green shoots push through the soil as summer approached. Tom visited often, bringing groceries or just sitting with Dad to reminisce about their childhood. I returned to architectural work part-time from home, a balance that let me keep caring for him while rebuilding my own career. The biggest change was in how Dad looked at me. The doubt that had crept in during Melissa and Brandon's campaign was gone, replaced with the steady trust we'd always had. One evening, as we watched the sun sink over the water, he said softly, "Emily, you didn't just save the house, you saved me." I thought about everything we had faced, the lies, the manipulation, the quiet cruelty disguised as care, and knew he was right. This had never just been about property. It was about standing up when it would have been easier to stay quiet, about protecting someone you love, even if it means standing against family. That's the thing about family, I told him. Sometimes you have to draw a line to keep it worth belonging to. If there's anything I could tell someone in a situation like ours, it would be to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything. Build allies before the storm hits. And remember that protecting someone's dignity is worth the fight, no matter how messy it gets. Dad nodded, his gaze on the water where the last streaks of sunlight shimmered. Your mother always said a house holds the soul of the family that lives in it, he murmured. This house is strong because you made it so. I smiled, feeling the truth of his words in my bones. Whatever came next, I knew we had already won the battle that mattered most.